Tamara Wilson sits frozen in first class as Captain Richard Keller's spit drips down her cheek. Other passengers gasp in shock. Tamara slowly wipes her face, reaches for her FBI badge. Richard's face pales when he realizes his fatal error. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe no one should face discrimination anywhere, especially not at 30,000 feet. Now let's see how this pilot's career came crashing down faster than a plane without engines. Tamara Wilson had never wanted to cause a scene. As a 38-year-old FBI agent with 15 years of distinguished service specializing in civil rights violations, she had built her career on remaining calm in volatile situations. Today was supposed to be a routine flight, Delta Airlines Flight 1823 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. Following a difficult week visiting her ailing mother who had recently been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Growing up in Silver Spring, Maryland, a predominantly white suburb, Tamara had experienced the subtle and not-so-subtle forms of racism that shaped her eventual career path. As the only black girl in her advanced placement classes, she'd endured everything from teachers who seemed surprised by her intelligence to classmates who touched her hair without permission. One particular incident stood out. When she was 16, a store security guard had followed her throughout a department store while ignoring her white friends. When she confronted him, he'd claimed it was standard procedure. That moment crystallized something for young Tamara: injustice thrived when good people stayed silent. This philosophy had carried her through Spelman College and then to the FBI Academy at Quantico, where she graduated near the top of her class. Throughout her 15-year career, she had built a reputation as methodical, by the book, and uncompromising when it came to upholding civil rights law. Her colleagues respected her even when they found her intensity intimidating. Just last month, she had been assigned to a high-profile interagency task force investigating the recent spike in hate crimes across the eastern seaboard. "You don't look like you belong in first class," the flight attendant, Nancy Peters according to her name tag, had said when Tamara boarded, eyeing her simple navy pantsuit with barely concealed suspicion. "Excuse me?" Tamara had responded, holding up her boarding pass. Nancy had scanned it with narrowed eyes. "Oh, I see. Well, can I help you find your seat?" Her tone suggested Tamara might not be able to read the seat assignment herself. It was the kind of microaggression Tamara had dealt with countless times. Small enough to make any reaction seem like an overreaction, yet pointed enough to deliver its intended message: "You don't belong here." Tamara had simply smiled tightly and replied, "I can manage, thank you," before taking her seat in 2C. As she settled in, arranging her small carry-on beneath the seat in front of her, Tamara had taken several deep breaths. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Pick your battles, baby girl. Some fights aren't worth the energy." With her mother's health deteriorating, Tamara had promised herself this trip would be stress-free. She would focus on getting home safely to prepare for her mother's transfer to a D.C. hospital next week. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had paid extra for a first-class seat specifically to avoid hassles and ensure a peaceful journey. As a federal agent who flew frequently for work, Tamara knew all too well how tense air travel could become. Yet even here, in the supposedly premium section of the aircraft, she couldn't escape the reality of being a black woman in America. Looking around the first-class cabin, Tamara had noted she was the only person of color in the section. Not unusual, but always noticeable. As other passengers boarded, several gave her curious glances, some friendly, others questioning. She had opened her book, a biography of Shirley Chisholm, and tried to lose herself in the story of America's first black congresswoman, hoping the 4-hour flight would pass quickly and uneventfully. If only she had known then how drastically this routine journey was about to change her life, and the lives of everyone watching this unfold. Captain Richard Keller strode through Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. At 52, with salt and pepper hair cropped into a military-style cut, he cut an imposing figure in his crisp pilot's uniform with 4 gold stripes on each sleeve. 25 years of flying experience had given him an air of unquestionable authority that he wore as comfortably as his well-tailored uniform. Richard had grown up in Newport, Rhode Island, the son of a naval admiral. His childhood home had overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, and his childhood memories were filled with sailing regattas and country club memberships. After graduating from the Air Force Academy, he had served 8 years as a military pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation. His service record was impeccable on paper, though those who served closely with him knew of his rigid worldview and dismissive attitude toward those he considered beneath him. Throughout his career with Delta, there had been whispers and informal complaints about Richard's behavior. A Nigerian flight attendant had reported that he had refused to learn her name, calling her simply, "you," throughout a transatlantic flight. A Latino co-pilot had requested a transfer after Richard had made comments about illegals taking American jobs. But none of these complaints had stuck. Richard's friendship with several airline executives, men he'd known from his military days or met on golf courses, had ensured that any formal complaints were quietly dismissed or buried in administrative files. As he conducted his pre-flight checks for Delta Flight 1823 to Washington, D.C., Richard chatted with his co-pilot, Vincent Hayes, a younger pilot with only 5 years at the airline. "Got a full flight today," Vincent remarked, reviewing the passenger manifest. "Yeah, and first class is booked solid. Though I saw they upgraded some woman who doesn't look like she belongs there," Richard said with a smirk. "Probably using some diversity points or something." Vincent shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, focusing instead on the instrument checks. This was his third flight with Captain Keller, and he'd quickly learned that challenging the senior pilot's comments only made for a tense cockpit. When Richard had emerged from the cockpit to greet special status passengers before takeoff, a courtesy extended to first-class travelers, his eyes had lingered on Tamara slightly longer than the others. Their initial interaction seemed innocent enough to casual observers. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he had said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "First time in first class?" Something in his tone had made Tamara look up sharply from her book. "No, Captain. I fly frequently for work." "Ah, work. And what line of work would that be?" he'd asked, his tone suggesting he doubted she had a profession that would warrant regular first-class travel. "Government," Tamara had replied simply, not owing him any further explanation. "Well, isn't that something," Richard had responded, his smile tightening. "Our tax dollars at work, I suppose." Before Tamara could respond, he had moved on to greet an older white couple across the aisle, his demeanor noticeably warmer. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, so good to see you again. Heading back to D.C. after your Florida vacation?" Other passengers had noticed the difference in his approach. Lawrence Jenkins, a black executive seated in 3A, had exchanged knowing glances with Tamara. Sophia Chen, an Asian American doctor in 1D, had frowned slightly at the interaction. And Bradley Thompson, a white retired teacher in 2D, no relation to the couple Richard had greeted warmly, had watched the exchange with a creased brow. As Richard returned to the cockpit, Tamara had overheard him say to Vincent, "These diversity hires are getting out of hand. Now they're taking up seats in first class too." The comment had been just loud enough for those in the first 2 rows to hear, and Tamara had felt her chest tighten with familiar anger. But as the flight prepared for takeoff, she had reminded herself again of her mother's words. This was a short flight. She would be home soon. Some battles weren't worth fighting. The aircraft had taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, leaving Atlanta behind. As they climbed to cruising altitude, none of the passengers could have predicted how this routine flight would soon become national news, or how it would expose not just one man's bigotry, but an entire system that had protected him for decades. 30 minutes into the flight, the first jolt of turbulence hit. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding as Captain Keller's voice came over the intercom, his tone professionally detached. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence as we pass through a weather system. Please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened until the sign is turned off." The plane dipped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. A baby in economy began crying. Flight attendant Nancy Peters stumbled slightly before grabbing the back of a seat to steady herself. Tamara's knuckles whitened around her armrests. Despite her frequent flying, turbulence always triggered her anxiety. She took slow, measured breaths, the techniques from her FBI training kicking in automatically. "Water, please," she requested as Nancy passed by her seat. The flight attendant barely glanced at her. "I'll have to wait until the turbulence passes." Yet moments later, Tamara watched as Nancy served a drink to the white businessman across the aisle. The disparity wasn't lost on her, but she remained silent, focusing instead on her breathing exercises. After about 20 minutes, the turbulence subsided. The seatbelt sign remained on, but the flight had stabilized enough that passengers began to relax. It was then that Captain Richard Keller emerged from the cockpit, supposedly to check on passengers after the rough patch. He moved through the first-class cabin with practiced charm, stopping to reassure nervous travelers. "Just a bit of rough air, nothing to worry about," he told an elderly couple with a warm smile. When he reached Tamara's row, his demeanor shifted subtly. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone cooler than it had been with other passengers. "I'd be better with some water," Tamara replied evenly. "I requested some earlier but was told it would have to wait." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "My flight attendants are following proper safety protocols. Perhaps in your line of work, you're not used to following rules." The comment hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone within earshot. The cabin grew quiet as nearby passengers tuned into the exchange. "Actually, Captain, I enforce rules for a living," Tamara responded, her voice calm but firm. "Including rules against discriminatory treatment." Richard's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting my crew is discriminating against you? That's a serious accusation." "I'm not making accusations," Tamara said. "I'm simply noting that the gentleman across from me received water during the same turbulence when I was denied." Several passengers nodded in agreement, having witnessed the same thing. "Perhaps you misunderstood the situation," Richard said dismissively. "We have procedures." "I understand procedures quite well," Tamara interrupted. "I also understand when they're being applied inconsistently." The captain's face flushed red. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen, I don't know what kind of government work you do, but on my aircraft, I'm the authority. Not you. Your authority doesn't extend to treating passengers differently based on their race," Tamara stated, still maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. "You people always play the race card," Richard hissed, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. "Maybe if you'd earned your way into first class instead of using some diversity program, I paid for this seat, Captain Keller," Tamara cut in, her patience wearing thin. "And your assumptions about me say more about your competence than mine. What would you do if a pilot spoke to you this way at 30,000 feet? Comment number 1 if you think Tamara should have stayed quiet to avoid escalation. Comment number 2 if you believe she was right to stand her ground. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear what happened next in this shocking confrontation. Just how far will Captain Keller go, and what will be the consequences of his actions? The answer might surprise you. That was the breaking point. Something in Richard snapped. His face contorted with rage, and before anyone could react, he did the unthinkable, he spat directly into Tamara's face. Time seemed to freeze as saliva dripped down Tamara's cheek. Gasps and cries of shock erupted throughout the cabin. Lawrence Jenkins half rose from his seat, instinctively moving to intervene. Sophia Chin covered her mouth in horror. Bradley Thompson exclaimed, "Dear God!" Tamara sat perfectly still, the humiliation burning through her like acid. With deliberate slowness, she reached for a tissue from her bag and wiped her face. Then, maintaining direct eye contact with Richard, she removed her FBI credentials from her jacket pocket. Special Agent Tamara Wilson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division, she stated, her voice steady despite the tremor of rage she felt. And you, Captain Keller, have just committed assault against a federal officer. The color drained from Richard's face as the implications hit him. His eyes darted around the cabin, now noticing the phones recording the incident, the witnesses watching in stunned silence, the undeniable evidence of his actions. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his authority evaporating. "I didn't mean to, save it for your statement," Tamara cut him off, rising to her feet. "You're going to need a very good lawyer." Chaos erupted in the first-class cabin. Passengers from economy, having heard the commotion, craned their necks to see what was happening. Several people were already uploading videos of the incident to social media, their fingers moving frantically across their screens. "He spit on her. Did you see that? She's FBI. Oh my God, he's done for." The voices overlapped in a cacophony of shock and outrage. Flight attendant Nancy Peters pushed through, her face pale with panic. "Captain Keller, please," she implored, placing herself between him and Tamara. "We need to de-escalate this situation." Richard's shock had quickly morphed into defensive anger. "She provoked me," he snapped. "She was undermining my authority in front of passengers. By asking for water." Lawrence Jenkins interjected from his seat. "Man, I saw the whole thing. You were out of line from the start." Richard pointed an accusing finger at Tamara. "This is a security issue now. I'm returning to the cockpit to ensure the safety of this aircraft. The only security threat on this plane is you, Captain," Tamara replied coolly, pulling out her phone. "And running back to the cockpit won't change that." As Richard retreated, practically sprinting toward the cockpit door, Tamara made 3 calls in rapid succession, first to her supervisor at the FBI, then to Delta Airlines executive offices, and finally to the Federal Aviation Administration. Her words were precise, her description of events clinical and detailed, as if she were reciting a case report rather than describing a personal assault. Inside the cockpit, co-pilot Vincent Hayes stared at Captain Keller in disbelief as the senior pilot ranted about the incident. "She was trying to create a scene, Vincent. These people always do this, looking for a payout, trying to make everything about race." Vincent, whose own father was Jamaican, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Richard," he said quietly, using the captain's first name for the first time, "did you actually spit on a passenger?" "It wasn't like that," Richard insisted, though his hands trembled slightly as he checked instruments that didn't need checking. "She was questioning my authority, my competence." "Jesus Christ," Vincent muttered, the implications sinking in. "Do you realize what you've done? That's assault, Richard. And she's FBI." "It'll be her word against mine," Richard said, though his voice lacked conviction. Vincent shook his head slowly. "There are at least 50 witnesses, probably a dozen videos already. This isn't going away." Back in the cabin, Air Marshal Curtis Reynolds had identified himself and was speaking quietly with Tamara. Despite being a victim, she had seamlessly shifted into her professional role, organizing the response with methodical efficiency. "We'll continue to the destination," Reynolds decided after conferring with Tamara and airline dispatch via radio. "Captain Keller will remain in the cockpit with the door locked. First Officer Hayes will handle the primary flying duties." Tamara nodded in agreement. "That's the safest option for everyone. I've already alerted our field office in D.C. They'll have agents meeting the plane." While this discussion took place, Tamara was simultaneously gathering evidence. She had borrowed a flight attendant's pad to document the names and contact information of key witnesses. Sophia Chen, the doctor seated in front of Tamara, had already written a detailed account of what she'd observed. Bradley Thompson was showing her the video he'd captured on his phone, which clearly showed Richard's unprovoked assault. "I've never seen anything like it in all my years of flying," Thompson said, his voice quavering with indignation. "To think that someone in his position would behave that way." "Unfortunately, I have seen it before," Tamara replied quietly. Just not usually so blatant, and rarely with so many witnesses. Nancy Peters hovered nervously nearby, her earlier dismissive attitude replaced by anxious obsequiousness. "Agent Wilson, is there anything you need? Anything at all?" Tamara fixed her with a level gaze. "I need you to tell the truth when we land. About what you saw today, and about any previous incidents involving Captain Keller." Nancy's eyes darted away. "I don't know what you mean," she mumbled. "I think you do," Tamara responded. "And I think a lot of people have been looking the other way for a long time." As the flight continued toward Washington, D.C., the story was already spreading across the internet. #CaptainSpitter was trending on Twitter. The airline's social media team was in full crisis mode, issuing a bland statement about investigating the incident and taking appropriate action. Little did they know that this was just the beginning. By the time Flight 1823 touched down at Reagan National Airport, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. What had started as one man's racist outburst was about to expose an entire culture of discrimination that had been festering for years beneath the surface of one of America's largest airlines. As Delta Flight 1823 began its descent into Reagan National Airport, the tension inside the aircraft was palpable. Captain Richard Keller remained locked in the cockpit, having not uttered a word over the intercom since the incident. Instead, First Officer Vincent Hayes had handled all announcements, his voice steady despite the unprecedented situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Washington, D.C. The local time is 4:45 p.m., and the temperature is 68 degrees. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, your tray tables are in their upright and locked position, and all carry-on items are secured beneath the seat in front of you or in the overhead compartments." Vincent paused, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "On behalf of the flight crew, I want to apologize for the disturbance earlier. I assure you that Delta Airlines takes the safety and dignity of all passengers very seriously, and appropriate actions are being taken. Thank you for your patience and understanding during this unusual situation." The apology was clearly Vincent's own initiative, not company policy, and several passengers nodded appreciatively at the young co-pilot's attempt to address the elephant in the room. In the first-class cabin, Tamara Wilson sat with perfect posture, her FBI notepad filled with witness statements and observations. She had spent the remainder of the flight in professional mode, compartmentalizing her personal feelings about the assault. There would be time later to process the humiliation, the anger, the visceral violation of having someone's bodily fluid land on her skin. For now, she focused on building a case. The landing was smoother than expected, given the circumstances. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Tamara could see through the windows that this was no ordinary arrival. 3 black SUVs with government plates waited on the tarmac. A small crowd of people in suits stood nearby, their expressions grim. "They're not taking any chances," Air Marshal Reynolds remarked from the seat beside her, where he'd relocated for the landing. "No, they're not," Tamara agreed. She recognized her direct superior, Assistant Director Evelyn Carter, among the waiting group. The presence of the FBI's third-in-command signaled just how seriously the Bureau was taking this incident. As the aircraft door opened, Assistant Director Carter was the first to board, followed by 2 other FBI agents and several airline executives in business attire. Their faces were masks of professional concern, though Tamara could read the panic behind their eyes. "Agent Wilson," Carter said, approaching Tamara directly. At 60, with steel-gray hair and impeccable posture, Carter had been one of the first black women to reach upper management at the Bureau. "Are you all right?" "Yes, ma'am," Tamara replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Carter nodded, understanding the unspoken. "We'll debrief fully at the office. For now, I need to know if you require medical attention." "No, ma'am." "But I'd like to be tested," Tamara said quietly, the implication clear. Any exchange of bodily fluids carried risks, a concern that had been hovering at the edges of her mind since the assault. "Already arranged," Carter assured her. "We have a medical team standing by." Meanwhile, 2 federal agents had proceeded directly to the cockpit. Moments later, they emerged with Richard Keller between them. The captain's face was ashen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He kept his eyes down as he was escorted past Tamara and the other first-class passengers who had witnessed his breakdown. Several passengers called out as he passed, "Shame on you. Racist. You're finished, buddy." Richard flinched at each comment but said nothing as he was led off the aircraft. The airline executives had spread throughout the cabin, speaking quietly with passengers, their voices low and urgent. Tamara overheard fragments of their conversations. "Assure you this doesn't reflect our values. Immediate administrative leave. Hoping we can resolve this without." One executive, a sleek woman in her 40s with a Delta Airlines pin on her lapel identifying her as Catherine Brooks, Vice President of Customer Experience, approached Tamara directly. "Agent Wilson, on behalf of Delta Airlines, I want to express our deepest apologies for this inexcusable incident. We would like to offer you, Ms. Brooks," Tamara interrupted calmly, "I appreciate your concern, but this is now an active federal investigation. Any discussions about resolution should go through the appropriate legal channels." Brooks' professional smile faltered slightly. "Of course. We just want you to know that Captain Keller's actions in no way represent Delta's values or policies." "This was an isolated incident, was it?" Tamara asked, her gaze unwavering. "Because I've already heard from 3 witnesses on this flight alone who've observed similar behavior from Captain Keller on previous flights. Indeed, during the remainder of the flight, several passengers and 1 flight attendant had quietly approached Tamara to share their experiences. A pattern was already emerging of a man who had been protected by the system for far too long." Brooks' smile disappeared completely. "I'm not aware of any previous complaints." "Then I suggest you check your records more carefully," Tamara said. "Because they exist, and we will find them." As passengers began to disembark, many paused to express support to Tamara or to confirm they would be willing to testify if needed. The atmosphere had transformed from the usual hurried exit to a somber procession, as if everyone recognized they had witnessed something historically significant. Outside the aircraft, the media storm was already in full force. News vans lined the arrivals area, reporters clutching microphones as they attempted to interview departing passengers. The airline had set up a special exit route for Tamara through a private security door, but she declined. "I have nothing to hide," she told Assistant Director Carter. "And neither should the airline." As Tamara emerged into the terminal flanked by FBI personnel, camera flashes erupted around her. She maintained her composure, neither seeking the spotlight nor shrinking from it. This was no longer just about one incident or one man's bigotry. It had become something much larger, a potential turning point in how corporations handle discrimination and how those in positions of power were held accountable for their actions. Back at the aircraft, Vincent Hayes was providing a statement to federal investigators, his career now at a crossroads. "It wasn't the first time I'd heard him make comments like that," the young co-pilot admitted. "But I never thought he'd go this far. I should have reported him sooner. I was afraid of what it would do to my career. That fear, of retaliation, of being labeled a troublemaker, of career suicide, had created the perfect environment for men like Richard Keller to thrive." But as the videos of his assault spread across the internet and more witnesses came forward, that protective shield of silence was beginning to crumble. For Tamara Wilson, the journey that had begun as a simple flight home from visiting her ailing mother had transformed into something she never sought but could not ignore, a very public test case for whether justice could truly be blind, even when the perpetrator wore a uniform with gold stripes on the sleeves. 1 week after the incident, Tamara Wilson sat at her desk in the FBI's Civil Rights Division, staring at the growing stack of evidence files. The case had expanded far beyond the original assault. What had started as one man's racist outburst was revealing itself to be symptomatic of a much larger problem within the airline industry. "You should be home resting," said Diego Ramirez, Tamara's partner of 3 years, as he placed a cup of coffee on her desk. At 42, with kind eyes and a methodical mind, Diego had been a steady presence throughout the chaos of the past week. "Can't rest," Tamara replied, not looking up from the witness statement she was reviewing. "Not with everything that's coming in." Since the video had gone viral, now with over 20 million views across various platforms, the FBI hotline established for the case had been flooded with calls. Former Delta employees, passengers, and even current staff using anonymous channels were coming forward with their own stories about Captain Richard Keller and a culture that had protected him. "You're temporarily reassigned to administrative duty anyway," Diego reminded her gently. "You don't have to carry this alone." Tamara finally looked up, fatigue evident in her eyes. "Have you seen the news this morning?" Diego nodded grimly. The media coverage had split dramatically along ideological lines. Some outlets portrayed Tamara as a hero standing up against systemic racism, while others questioned her motives, suggesting she had provoked the incident to gain publicity or leverage a lawsuit. One particularly vicious commentator had said on national television, "Why is it that certain people always find themselves at the center of these so-called racial incidents? Maybe Agent Wilson went into that flight looking for trouble." The suggestion that she had somehow orchestrated being spat upon was so absurd that Tamara might have laughed if it weren't so painful. Instead, she had shut off the TV and buried herself deeper in work. "Any update on your mother?" Diego asked, changing the subject. Tamara's expression softened slightly at the mention of her mother. "The doctors say the stress isn't helping her condition. She's seen the news, of course. Keeps telling me she's proud, but I can tell she's worried." What Tamara didn't mention was the threatening calls her mother had received at the hospital, anonymous voices spewing hate, blaming her for raising a race baiter who was trying to destroy a good man's career. The hospital had increased security as a precaution, adding another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. "We found something you should see," Diego said, pulling up a chair beside her desk. He opened his laptop and navigated to a folder of screenshots. The cyber team was doing background on Keller and found these. Tamara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled through the images. They were posts from various white supremacist forums and private Facebook groups, many using a username that had been linked to Richard's personal email address. "How long has he been posting this stuff?" she asked, her stomach churning at the violent rhetoric and explicit racism displayed on the screen. "Years," Diego replied. "Some date back to 2015. He was careful, used VPNs, alternate accounts, but not careful enough. And get this, he was an administrator for a private group called The Cockpit, exclusively for commercial pilots who, in their words, aren't afraid to speak the truth about the diversity invasion." Tamara sat back in her chair, processing this new information. So this wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. This is who he is. Exactly. And there's more. We've identified at least 7 other pilots from various airlines in that same group. The investigation is expanding. The implications were staggering. If multiple pilots across different airlines were participating in these forums, sharing these beliefs, how many passengers had been subjected to biased treatment without the protection of video evidence or FBI credentials? Have you ever experienced discrimination while traveling? Comment number 1 if you've faced similar treatment, or comment number 2 if you've witnessed it happening to someone else. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow this important story. What do you think should happen to pilots or other professionals who harbor racist views while serving the public? How deep does this discrimination go in the airline industry? As Tamara and Diego continued reviewing the evidence, Assistant Director Carter entered the office, her expression grave. "We've got a problem," she announced without preamble. "The airline is pushing for a quick settlement. Their legal team has reached out offering a significant sum if you'll sign an NDA and agree not to pursue criminal charges." Tamara's jaw clenched. They can't make criminal charges go away with a private settlement. "No, But they're hoping you'll decline to testify, which would significantly weaken the case, Carter explained. They're offering 7 figures, Tamara. And some higher-ups at the bureau think you should take it. What? Tamara stood up, incredulous. Who's saying that? Carter sighed. There's concern about the publicity, the polarization. Some feel that a protracted legal battle will only deepen racial tensions and reflect poorly on the bureau. So I should just take the money and let him get away with it. Let all of them get away with it. Tamara gestured to the evidence spread across her desk. This isn't just about me anymore. I know that, Carter said quietly. And for what it's worth, I agree with you. But you should be prepared for pressure from unexpected sources. After Carter left, Tamara sat in silence, conflict raging within her. The settlement money could pay for her mother's medical treatments, ensure she received the best care possible. It could provide financial security that a government salary never would. And it would end the media circus, the threats, the strain on her family. But it would also mean that Richard Keller would likely face minimal consequences. The airline would issue a press release about his retirement, implement some superficial diversity training, and everything would continue as before. The other pilots identified in the cockpit forum would remain in their positions, their biases unchallenged. Nothing would really change. That evening, Tamara visited her mother at Georgetown University Hospital. Elaine Wilson had lost weight since her diagnosis, but her eyes remained sharp and perceptive as ever. You're carrying too much, baby, she said as Tamara arranged fresh flowers by her bedside. I'm fine, Mama. No, you're not. And you don't have to pretend with me. Elaine patted the edge of the bed, inviting her daughter to sit. They offered you money, didn't they? Tamara looked up, surprised. How did you know? Because that's what they always do when they're scared, Elaine replied with the wisdom of someone who had seen this pattern play out over decades. They think they can put a price tag on dignity. The money could help with your treatments, Tamara said quietly. Get you into that experimental program at Johns Hopkins. Elaine reached for her daughter's hand. Tamara Jean Wilson, you listen to me. I did not raise you to sell your soul, not even for me. Especially not for me. Her grip tightened. What happened to you on that plane wasn't just an assault on you, it was an assault on every black person who's ever been told they don't belong. If you let them buy your silence, you're telling the next generation that's what their dignity is worth too. Tears welled in Tamara's eyes. I'm just so tired, Mama. I know, baby. Fighting is exhausting. But you've never been one to back down from a righteous fight. Elaine's voice softened. Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you. But I want you to decide based on what's right, not on what's easy or what you think I need. As Tamara left the hospital that night, her phone buzzed with a text from Diego, you need to see this ASAP. Attached was a screenshot of text messages between Richard Keller and another pilot, dated the morning of the fateful flight. In it, Richard wrote, got a black woman in first class today who thinks she's entitled to special treatment. Bet she's using a free upgrade. Going to make sure she knows her place. The other pilot had responded, be careful man. Not worth the hassle. To which Richard had replied, these people need to be put in their place sometimes. I'm tired of walking on eggshells around them. Tamara stared at the screen, a cold clarity washing over her. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. It wasn't a bad day or a stress reaction. It was premeditated harassment based solely on the color of her skin. She texted Diego back, tell Carter I'm not taking the settlement. We're seeing this through to the end. Whatever personal cost she might bear, whatever strain it placed on her family, whatever vitriol the media might direct her way, none of it outweighed the importance of exposing the truth. Not just about one pilot, but about a system that had protected him and others like him for far too long. The real investigation was just beginning. The downtown Washington, D.C. law offices of Hartwell and Reed gleamed with old money and establishment power. Rich mahogany paneling lined the conference room where Tamara Wilson now sat, facing Richard Keller and his defense team across a polished table that probably cost more than her annual salary. "My client was under extraordinary stress that day," said James Hartwell, a silver-haired attorney whose client list included politicians and corporate executives. He had received news of his mother's declining health that morning, had been working extra shifts due to staff shortages, and was concerned about navigational issues during the flight. Tamara kept her expression neutral as Hartwell continued to build a narrative of extenuating circumstances, painting Richard as a dedicated professional who had one regrettable lapse in judgment during an unusually stressful day. Richard himself sat with downcast eyes, the picture of contrition in a carefully selected navy suit with no tie, a deliberate styling choice to make him appear more vulnerable and less authoritarian than his usual uniformed presence. Furthermore, Hartwell continued, Captain Keller has an exemplary 25-year record with Delta Airlines. He has safely transported over 1 million passengers throughout his career. This isolated incident should not define a man who has served his country, both in the military and as a commercial pilot, with distinction. When Hartwell finally paused, U.S. Attorney Monica Benson, who was leading the prosecution, leaned forward slightly. "Are you finished, counselor?" Hartwell nodded, confident in his presentation. "Then let me be clear," Benson said, her voice level but intense. "Your client's exemplary record includes at least 23 informal complaints of discriminatory behavior that were systematically buried by the airline. His stress on that particular day didn't spontaneously create racist attitudes, it merely removed his filter. And most damningly, we have evidence that he specifically targeted Agent Wilson before even interacting with her." She slid copies of the text messages across the table. Richard visibly paled as he recognized his own words. "This isn't about one bad day, Mr. Hartwell. This is about a pattern of behavior that culminated in a federal crime, assault on a government agent, that happened to be captured on video. Your client isn't a victim of circumstances. He's a perpetrator who finally got caught." The pre-trial meeting continued for another hour, with Richard's team floating potential plea deals and reduced charges. None were accepted. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell made one final attempt. "Agent Wilson," he said, addressing Tamara directly for the first time, "my client is prepared to make a personal apology and offer significant financial compensation if we can resolve this matter without a trial. 7 figures, as I believe you've already been informed." Tamara gathered her documents slowly, deliberately, before meeting his gaze. "Mr. Hartwell, your client didn't just spit on me. He spat on the dignity of every person who's ever been made to feel they don't belong somewhere because of their race. That's not something you can settle with a check and a rehearsed apology." Outside the law office, a small group of protesters had gathered. Some held signs supporting Tamara, "Stand with Agent Wilson," and "End racism in the skies." But others supported Richard, Keller served his country, and, more disturbingly, Wilson provoked it. This division reflected the broader public reaction to the case. While the majority of Americans expressed outrage at the video, a vocal minority had begun characterizing Tamara as an angry black woman, who had deliberately provoked Richard to advance a political agenda. Some fringe commentators even suggested the entire incident was staged, despite the overwhelming video evidence. The pressure on Tamara was immense. Her personal phone number had been leaked online, forcing her to change it. Her home address had been posted on extremist forums, necessitating security measures installed by the FBI. Even her mother, now transferred to Johns Hopkins for specialized treatment, had to be registered under a pseudonym to protect her privacy. Yet the most unexpected pressure came from within the system itself. That evening, Tamara received a call from Deputy Director Phillips, the second highest-ranking official at the FBI. "Agent Wilson," he began without preamble, "I understand you've declined the settlement offer." "Yes, sir," Tamara confirmed, sensing where this conversation was heading. "I respect your dedication to principle," Phillips continued, his tone suggesting otherwise, but you should consider the broader implications. This case is becoming a political lightning rod. The Bureau tries to stay above such partisan divisions. With all due respect, sir, standing against discrimination shouldn't be a partisan issue. In an ideal world, perhaps. But we don't live in an ideal world. Philip sighed audibly. The airline is now offering $8 million, Tamara. That's life-changing money. It could pay for your mother's treatment, set you up for retirement, do a lot of good. The mention of her mother felt like a deliberate manipulation, and Tamara's resolve hardened. My decision stands, sir. This isn't about money. After the call ended, Tamara sat in her apartment, surrounded by case files and the remains of a takeout dinner she'd barely touched. The weight of it all, the public scrutiny, the threats, the pressure from above, her concern for her mother, pressed down on her like a physical force. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diego, turn on CNN. Vincent Hayes is talking. Tamara grabbed the remote and switched on the television to see Vincent Hayes, Richard's co-pilot, being interviewed by a prominent news anchor. He looked nervous but determined. I should have spoken up sooner, Vincent was saying, his voice slightly unsteady. There were signs, comments Captain Keller would make when it was just the two of us in the cockpit. Things about passengers, about flight attendants, especially people of color. Can you give us an example? The anchor prompted. Vincent nodded. On one flight, we had a Middle Eastern family in first class. After greeting them, he came back to the cockpit and said we should probably keep an extra eye on them, even though they were just a regular family with children. On another occasion, he referred to a black flight attendant as affirmative action in action, because she had trouble with a beverage cart during turbulence. And did you report these incidents? Vincent's expression was pained. No. And that's something I'll have to live with. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it would be career suicide to report a senior captain. But watching that video, seeing what he did to Agent Wilson. He shook his head. I can't be silent anymore. And I know there are others who have stories too. As if to confirm Vincent's claim, the segment cut to a montage of interviews with former Delta employees, all sharing similar experiences with Richard Keller. One black flight attendant described being called "girl" despite her 20 years of experience. A Latino ground crew member recalled Richard refusing to acknowledge his presence during pre-flight checks, speaking only to his white colleagues. The most damning testimony came from Richard's former flying partner, Captain Gerald Stevens, who had retired 3 years earlier. It wasn't just casual racism, Stevens explained gravely. Richard believed in white supremacy. He told me once that he thought segregation had been better for everyone. When I reported him to management, I was told to mind my own business. 6 months later, I was reassigned to less desirable routes. The message was clear, don't rock the boat. Watching these testimonies, Tamara felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also a deep sadness that so many people had suffered in silence for so long. And beneath it all, a steely determination that this time would be different. This time, there would be consequences. Her phone rang again, Diego calling. You seeing this? He asked when she answered. Yes. It's breaking open, just like we thought. It's bigger than we realized, Tamara. The airline employees union just contacted us. They've been collecting complaints about discriminatory behavior for years, not just about Keller but across the industry. They want to meet. This was the tipping point Tamara had been working toward, the moment when individual grievances coalesced into a pattern that couldn't be dismissed or settled away. The case was no longer just about one man spitting on one woman. It was about an entire system that had protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. As she hung up, Tamara's gaze fell on a framed photograph on her bookshelf, herself at graduation from the FBI Academy, standing proudly beside her mother. She remembered what Elaine had said to her that day, justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, baby. It's about changing the conditions that allow wrongdoing to flourish. With renewed purpose, Tamara returned to the case files spread across her dining table. There would be no settlement, no quiet resolution. Richard Keller and Delta Airlines would have their day in court, and the truth would finally be heard, not just by a jury, but by the world. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. buzzed with tension on the morning the trial began. News vans lined Constitution Avenue, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Protesters from both sides held signs and chanted slogans, separated by barriers and watchful police officers. Inside Courtroom 4, Judge Eleanor Simmons, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the federal bench, addressed the packed gallery. "Let me be clear from the outset," she announced, her voice carrying authority without needing to be raised. "This courtroom is not a theater, not a political arena, and certainly not a social media platform. It is a place where facts will be presented, evidence will be evaluated, and justice will be determined according to the law. Anyone who cannot respect that purpose will be removed immediately." Her warning set the tone for what would become one of the most closely watched trials of the year. The formal charges against Richard Keller included assault on a federal officer, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice for his attempts to destroy text messages after the incident. Additionally, 3 Delta executives faced charges of conspiracy and obstruction for their role in suppressing previous complaints against Keller. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Monica Benson with Tamara's testimony as its centerpiece, methodically built its case over 2 weeks. Video evidence from multiple angles showed the assault in undeniable detail. Witness after witness testified to Richard's behavior on the flight and his history of discriminatory actions. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Tamara herself, who spoke not just about the incident but about the lifetime of similar experiences that had preceded it. "This wasn't the first time I've experienced discrimination," she explained to the rapt jury, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "It happens in small ways almost daily, being followed in stores, having my credentials questioned, watching people clutch their bags tighter when I enter an elevator. But it was the first time someone felt entitled enough, protected enough by the system, to physically assault me for simply existing in a space they didn't think I belonged." When asked by the defense if she had provoked Richard in any way, Tamara's response was measured but pointed, requesting the same service other passengers received and expecting to be treated with basic human dignity is not provocation. "If Captain Keller felt provoked by my existence in first class or my unwillingness to accept discriminatory treatment, that speaks to his prejudice, not my behavior." The defense strategy, predictably, focused on Richard's previously unblemished record and attempted to paint the incident as an isolated lapse of judgment during a period of extreme personal stress. They brought in character witnesses, fellow pilots, community members from his church, even his elderly father, to testify to his decency and service. But the prosecution's case was bolstered by explosive new evidence. Internal airline emails revealed that Delta management had been aware of at least 17 formal complaints against Richard over the years, all of which had been systematically downgraded, dismissed, or buried in administrative files. In one particularly damning email, a senior executive had written, "Keller's technical skills are too valuable to lose over these sensitivity issues. Handle it quietly and keep it out of his permanent record." The airline's attorney argued that these were isolated failures of process, not evidence of systemic discrimination. But the pattern was clear to everyone in the courtroom, and to the millions following the case through news reports and social media. Expert testimony from Dr. Anita Thompson, a leading researcher on institutional racism in the transportation industry, provided context for the jury. "What we're seeing here isn't unusual," she explained. "The airline industry, like many others with historically white male leadership, has structures in place that protect those who fit the traditional mold while placing additional burdens on those who don't. When incidents occur, there's a tendency to treat them as isolated problems rather than symptoms of a deeper issue." As the trial entered its 3rd week, an unexpected witness approached the stand. Patricia Keller, Richard's ex-wife of 15 years. Over strenuous objections from the defense, Judge Simmons allowed her testimony. Patricia spoke quietly but clearly about the racist views Richard had expressed throughout their marriage. He would come home from flights and complain about having to serve passengers he called affirmative action first class, meaning people of color in premium cabins. He believed they hadn't earned their place there, that they must have been given special treatment because of their race. She described how Richard had forbidden their children from dating outside their race and had left their church when it hired a black associate pastor. The Richard who spat on Agent Wilson isn't some stressed-out version of my ex-husband, she concluded. It's who he truly is when he feels powerful enough to show it. Her testimony visibly affected several jurors, who glanced at Richard with newly critical eyes. Richard himself sat stoically, his gaze fixed on the table before him. In a desperate move, the defense called Richard to testify on his own behalf, a risk that quickly backfired. Under Benson's skillful cross-examination, Richard's carefully constructed facade of contrition crumbled. When pressed about his text messages and online posts, he became defensive and combative. "You have to understand the pressure we're under," he insisted, his voice rising. "Political correctness has gone too far. We can't even speak honestly anymore without someone claiming discrimination. Is spitting in a passenger's face what you consider speaking honestly, Captain Keller?" Benson asked calmly. Richard's face flushed. "That was a mistake. I've said that repeatedly." "A mistake," Benson repeated thoughtfully. "Like accidentally typing the wrong letter or turning down the wrong street. Not a deliberate act of contempt directed at a black woman who dared to question your authority. She was undermining me in front of other passengers. By asking for water. By pointing out that others had received service denied to her." As Richard struggled to explain, his carefully crafted image of a dedicated professional who had one bad day collapsed entirely. After 3 weeks of testimony, mountains of evidence, and powerful closing arguments from both sides, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 6 hours before reaching their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Simmons asked Richard to stand. The jury foreman, a middle-aged white man who had once worked as a commercial pilot himself, delivered the verdict. "On the count of assault on a federal officer, we find the defendant, Richard Allen Keller, guilty. On the count of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." Similar guilty verdicts were announced for the airline executives charged with covering up previous complaints. As the verdicts were read, Tamara closed her eyes briefly, a wave of emotion washing over her that she couldn't entirely suppress. It wasn't joy or triumph she felt, but something more complex. A vindication that carried with it both relief and sadness that such vindication had been necessary at all. The case that had begun with a moment of shocking bigotry captured on video had exposed not just one man's prejudice but an entire system designed to protect those in power from the consequences of their actions. And while that system wouldn't change overnight, the verdict sent a clear message: those days of impunity were ending. Outside the courthouse, as reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, Tamara stood at the microphones not as a victim but as the federal agent she had always been, composed, professional, and committed to justice. "Today's verdict isn't about one incident or one person," she stated. "It's about accountability. It's about acknowledging that no one, regardless of their position, their uniform, or their connections, is above the law or exempt from basic human decency. The journey toward true equality is far from over, but today represents an important step forward." As she stepped away from the podium, surrounded by her FBI colleagues and legal team, Tamara knew that while this chapter was closing, the real work of systemic change was just beginning. And she was ready for it. 6 months after the verdict, Tamara Wilson stood at the podium in the Department of Justice's Great Hall, the historic room's ornate ceiling and marble columns lending gravity to the occasion. Before her sat representatives from every major airline in the country, transportation industry regulators, civil rights organizations, and the media. "Today marks a new chapter in ensuring equal treatment for all travelers," she began, her voice steady and clear. The Civil Rights in Transit Initiative will establish industry-wide protocols for addressing discrimination, create independent oversight committees, and implement mandatory training programs focused not just on awareness but on actionable change. As the newly appointed head of the FBI's expanded Civil Rights Enforcement Division, Tamara had spent months developing this comprehensive program. What had begun as a personal ordeal had transformed into institutional reform that would affect millions of travelers. After her speech, as attendees mingled during the reception, Assistant Director Evelyn Carter approached her with a rare smile. "Not bad for someone who just wanted a quiet flight home," Carter said, handing Tamara a glass of sparkling water. Tamara returned the smile. "I never wanted to be the face of this issue." "Few who create real change ever do," Carter replied. "They just refuse to accept injustice when it's staring them in the face, or spitting in it." The case had indeed catalyzed widespread changes. Richard Keller had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for the assault and civil rights violations, plus an additional year for obstruction of justice. The judge had also mandated that upon release, he would complete 2,000 hours of community service working with organizations serving minority communities. Beyond the criminal penalties, the civil repercussions had been equally significant. Delta Airlines had settled a class action lawsuit brought by minority employees, agreeing to a $100 million compensation fund and sweeping changes to their hiring, promotion, and complaint procedures. Similar suits had quickly followed against other major carriers, as employees emboldened by Tamara's stand came forward with their own experiences of discrimination. The airline industry, forced to confront its troubled history, had begun implementing structural changes. Bias reporting systems with actual accountability measures. Anonymous third-party review of discrimination complaints. Diversity initiatives with teeth rather than just public relations value. The changes weren't perfect, and resistance remained, but progress was undeniable. For Tamara personally, the aftermath had been complex. The settlement from her own civil suit against the airline, which she had finally accepted after the criminal case concluded, had provided financial security for her family. Her mother's medical treatments were fully covered, and Elaine Wilson was now in remission, her fierce spirit intact despite the physical toll of cancer treatment. But the case had also forever altered Tamara's life in ways both positive and challenging. She had become, reluctantly, a public figure, recognized in airports, restaurants, on the street. Some approached her with gratitude, others with hostility. She had received death threats serious enough to necessitate ongoing security precautions. Yet she had also received thousands of letters from people sharing their own experiences and thanking her for giving them courage to speak up. 3 months after the sentencing, Tamara had made the difficult decision to visit Richard in prison. It wasn't for forgiveness or closure, concepts she found inadequate for addressing systemic injustice, but to complete the circle of accountability. The visit had been brief but consequential. Richard, stripped of his uniform and status, had seemed smaller somehow in his prison khakis. "I didn't expect to see you here," he'd said when she sat across from him in the visiting room. "I didn't expect to be here," Tamara had replied honestly. "But I wanted to ask you something that wasn't addressed in the trial." "What's that?" "Do you understand now? Not just that what you did was wrong, but why it was wrong." Richard had been silent for a long moment, studying the table between them. "I've had a lot of time to think," he finally said. "About my actions, yes, but also about the things I believed. The things I was taught to believe. And I'm beginning to see how wrong I was. Not just that day on the plane, but for most of my life." He'd looked up then, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "I'm working with a counselor here. Reading books I should have read years ago. It's uncomfortable. Realizing the person you've been isn't the person you thought you were. It wasn't a dramatic transformation or a Hollywood moment of redemption. It was small, tentative, and possibly temporary. But it was something, a crack in the foundation of prejudice that might, with continued work, widen into genuine change." Now, as the reception at the Justice Department wound down, Tamara checked her phone to find a text from Diego, "Turn on CNN when you get a chance. They're running a special report on the first graduating class from the new FAA Diversity Initiative." Later that evening, Tamara watched the report from her living room, a sense of quiet satisfaction washing over her as she saw the diverse group of pilot trainees receiving their certificates. Among them was a young black woman who, when interviewed, said simply, "Agent Wilson showed us that standing up for yourself can change not just your life, but the system itself. That's why I'm here." The next morning, Tamara prepared for her first flight since the incident. As a frequent flyer for her new role, she couldn't avoid air travel forever, though she admitted to herself a lingering apprehension as she entered Reagan National Airport. This time, the experience was markedly different. The ticketing agent greeted her warmly by name, not because of recognition from the news, but because she was a valued customer. The security screening was professional and efficient. And when she boarded, the flight crew welcomed her with genuine respect. The first-class flight attendant, a young black man named Jamal, offered her a pre-departure beverage with a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "It's an honor to serve you, Agent Wilson," he said quietly. "What you did changed things for a lot of us." As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Tamara looked out the window at the Washington monuments receding in the distance. The journey that had begun with an act of bigotry had led to meaningful change, not complete or perfect, but real nonetheless. There would be more battles ahead, more resistance to overcome, more systems to reform. But for this moment, watching the ground fall away as the plane climbed into the clear blue sky, Tamara allowed herself to feel something that had been scarce in recent months: hope. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination while traveling? Should bystanders speak up or mind their business? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can all contribute to creating more respectful environments. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread awareness about the ongoing fight against discrimination. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a difficult but important story. Remember, change begins with each of us standing up for what's right, even when it's challenging. This powerful story of Tamara Wilson's encounter with Captain Richard Keller illuminates crucial truths about confronting discrimination. First, silence perpetuates injustice. When good people remain quiet, prejudice thrives unchallenged. Second, systems protect those with power until someone brave enough disrupts the pattern. Third, real change requires both individual courage and institutional reform. Tamara's personal stand sparked industry-wide transformation. The journey demonstrates how discrimination operates at multiple levels, from microaggressions to outright assault. And how institutions often prioritize protecting their image over addressing underlying problems. It shows that accountability isn't just about punishing wrongdoing but changing conditions that allow wrongdoing to flourish. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that one person standing firm in their dignity can create ripples affecting countless others. Tamara never sought to become a symbol or catalyst, but by refusing to accept injustice, she became exactly that. Proving that speaking truth to power, despite personal cost, remains one of our most potent tools for social change. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and struggled with whether to speak up? Share your experience in the comments below. What would you have done in Tamara's position? Comment, courage, if you believe standing firm against injustice is worth the personal cost, or caution, if you think picking your battles is wiser. Don't forget to like this video if you found Tamara's journey inspiring, subscribe for more powerful true stories about everyday heroes challenging the status quo, and share with someone who needs this message of courage and perseverance. Thank you for joining our community of thoughtful viewers who believe in creating a more just world. Remember, change begins with awareness, continues with action, and succeeds through persistence, just like Tamara showed us.